Welcome back to Vivid Noise. Today we're going to be talking about Colin McRae DiRT and the specific kind of game that I've noticed that it belongs to. Have you ever noticed how, in retrospect, you realize that certain games are like a sort of transitional period for a certain series? What I mean is, when the game's new, you don't really think much of it. It's just kind of like, okay, it's just another game. But then a couple years later, you start to realize that particular entry planted the seeds for what would end up becoming the future of said franchise. I'm specifically using Colin McRae DiRT as the basis for what I want to talk about here, because I feel like this game is a very, very strong example of exactly what I'm talking about right now. For all intents and purposes, DiRT isn't really a DiRT game as far as what we know as the DiRT brand, but rather it's just Colin McRae 6. In fact, if you look in the game files, there's a folder called CMR6. That's not to say that it actually is a CMR6. No, it does take many steps to bring the brand closer to how we know it today. It introduces the different race disciplines. It started to sort of change the presentation to be a little more in your face. Although in a lot of ways, it feels very firmly placed in the past of the franchise. Personally, I've always seen DiRT 2 as the next step in what Codemasters racing games would be as far as that generation goes, because now their games are a little bit different still. In fact, when it comes to Codemasters rally games, you can really break them down into three distinct eras. The classic Colin McRae era, the sort of mid to late 2000s and early 2010s DiRT era, and then the DiRT rally era, and then there was DiRT 5, which exists, I guess. You could almost apply this to their more conventional racing games as well, like how you had the Toka games, then you had Grid, and now we have like a new generation Grid in a way. I feel like you can break down the transitional type of game into three categories. So you've got the kind where, for example, you've got a new development studio, and their first game is essentially an exercise in how well they can match the original formula before delving in and trying to sort of do their own thing. There are two very distinct examples of this kind of game within the Need for Speed franchise. The first of which would be the PlayStation 2 version of Hot Pursuit 2, and then you would also have Need for Speed Rivals. What these two games share in common, other than the cops versus racers formula, is the fact that both of them were made by what was at that point fresh blood, that clearly looked at the games prior and took the most distinct elements of each of them and just made something new and more polished out of that. Well, I'm not sure if more polish could necessarily apply to Rivals, but, you know, they tried. Both of these games were also a sort of last hurrah for that particular style. So for Hot Pursuit 2, for a very long time, that game was the last cops versus racers sort of Need for Speed game. And the same thing with Rivals, you know, because you had Hot Pursuit 2010, Most Wanted 2012, both of which were, well, Hot Pursuit 2010 was an open world, Most Wanted 2012 was, but both of them had a very heavy emphasis on police chases and not so much on customization, and same thing with Rivals. That game was open world, it had almost no customization, it had like an emphasis on weapons, and again, the cops were in the forefront. And with both Hot Pursuit 2 and Rivals, right afterwards, we saw a complete shift, no pun intended. Right after Hot Pursuit 2, we got Underground 1, and really the start of that era of Need for Speed. And right after Rivals, we got 2015, which was a sort of return to the tuner thing, although they quickly changed direction again with Payback. Although that game still had lots of car tuning, it was just the tone of the game was very different. And, you know, it had a day and night cycle and everything. And then Heat and Unbound, you know, they kind of kept that going, just with a slightly lesser emphasis on like the Hollywood antics, you know. I don't really talk about fighting games much, but I feel like Mortal Kombat 4 and Deadly Alliance represent the kind of transitional game where you got the same developers simply attempting to bring the franchise into a more modern style of gameplay while also updating the visual sensibilities. So in Mortal Kombat 4, it's pretty much the same gameplay as it used to be, but now with 3D models and, you know, bigger environments to an extent, and also weapons you can pick up. And then with Deadly Alliance, you've got full-on sidestepping, some more interactive environments, an actual, like, real weapon system, and a complete overhaul of the fighting mechanics. So you got different fighting styles along with a dedicated weapon mode. It may not be too surprising, but the transitional sort of games I'm talking about right now are very, very rarely the peak of whatever formula, whatever style a certain series is going for. An exception would definitely be something like Hot Pursuit 2, and that's a fantastic game. I already did a video on it, but for example, Mortal Kombat 4, yeah, it's generally not everyone's favorite example of the classic kind of Mortal Kombat, much like how Deadly Alliance, while it has its fans, generally people agree that Deception is quite a bit better. And then Armageddon. I don't know, do people hate Armageddon? I think its biggest problem was the fact that it like didn't really have actual fatalities. Anyway, that's getting off track. Another example would be the ever so infamous Sonic 06. Yes, I consider that a transitional game. Some would consider it Sonic Unleashed, but no, with Unleashed, they had already taken the boost formula from the Rush games and just taken it to the extreme. You could also kind of consider Secret Rings a boost game because of the speed break, but personally, I don't see it that way. The reason why I consider Sonic 06 to sort of be a transitional point in the series is because it's really the last of its kind. Sonic 06 is the last adventure style, the adventure formula kind of Sonic game. Multiple playable characters, no 2D sections, a very heavy emphasis on a plot that takes itself seriously for the most part. It really is Sonic Adventure free for all intents and purposes. I mean, people have been sort of making these like posts where it's like, choose your Sonic Adventure free, Heroes, Shadow, 06, etc., right? But out of all of them, 06 feels the most like adventure free. It's pretty much a Dreamcast era Sonic game, but with HD visuals. Well, you know, HD for 2006. Then you've got the curious case of something like, let's say, Tekken Tag Tournament. What that game essentially did was take Tekken Free, massively overhaul the visuals, give it one of the cleanest soundtracks I've ever heard in a fighting game, but put a spin on the main gameplay by giving it the tag mechanic. Now, I actually did a little bit of research, and by that I mean I looked up like one video, and it turns out they actually have this thing called Team Battle in Tekken 4, and I'm guessing onwards, although Tag Battle in of itself, I don't think returns until, well, Tekken Tag Tournament 2, which is really good. I feel like just the updated presentation is why Tekken Tag Tournament is actually one of my favorite Tekken games, despite my limited exposure to the series. I mean, I've played 1, 2, Free, and Tag Tournament, and also Tag Tournament 2, but I don't know, I just really love that 2000 vibe of the original Tekken Tag Tournament. I mean, come on, you've probably seen my Ridge Racer video, you know why I'm saying this. Another sort of pair of examples I can think of is Tony Hawk Pro Skater Free and 4. With Tony Hawk Free, it really is just a facelift, right? Fundamentally, it's the same kind of game as the last two, but just much prettier, much smoother, and controversially, I guess, much better. I don't know, there seems to be like this never-ending debate between whether or not Tony Hawk 2 or Free is better. Personally, I like Free more, sue me. But then you have Pro Skater 4, where they've essentially taken the art direction and just the general sensibilities, the style of the previous games, and gone open world. Not fully open world, but you've got these larger maps with these missions within them that you get to choose. It really feels like that natural midway point between the classic Tony Hawk formula and the Underground formula, which would later be expanded upon in stuff like Underground 2, Project 8, Proving Grounds, and then Garbage, but you know, finally we got the good remake though. What's actually kind of incredible is that there are some series where there is no transitional game. You just directly jump into that new shape that the series is gonna take. So for example, you got stuff like Grand Theft Auto, which just instantly went into the new direction of GTA Free. There was really nothing leading up to it. They just took what worked and just went, okay, we're 3D now, and maybe you could see GTA Free as a transitional game, but no, I just see it as just that next step, and it stands on its own. And then you have Vice City and San Andreas, and it was just a very natural evolution. There was no distinct experimental transitional period with that series. It was just these very confident steps. And on the other hand, you've got the kind of franchises that wouldn't really have room for a transitional game. So a really easy example would be, you know, sports games like FIFA or maybe Madden or maybe even the F1 games by Codemasters to a certain extent. Despite also being an annual series, Call of Duty had that moment in a way with World at War, not Modern Warfare. That was a very confident new take on the series, right? That was just that next step. But with World at War, it felt like a midway point in between Call of Duty Free and Black Ops. I think the reason why I find these kind of games so interesting is that it really reminds you that games are made by people who want to try new things. No matter how corporate this industry might get, there's always that layer of just a tiny little bit of experimentation. You know, let's push the color palette more in this sort of color. Let's have this instrument emphasize more in the sound design, the tiny little things which might become a much larger part of a series' identity. Thank you so much for watching another episode of Vivid Noise, and I'll catch you guys at the next one.